Hello, my dear friends. Imagine the Colosseum before the noise begins. The sun is already high above Rome, but inside the massive stone structure, the air feels heavy and still. Tens of thousands of people are slowly taking their seats, not yet shouting, not yet excited, just waiting. The arena floor below them is empty for now, covered with sand carefully spread to hide stains from earlier days. This place does not exist for fairness. It exists for spectacle. The Roman Colosseum was not designed to show equal contests. It was designed to show power. Power of Rome. Power of the crowd. Power of life and death controlled by the state. What happened inside this arena followed rules, but those rules were not about justice. They were about drama, fear, and control, and many people today imagine gladiator fights as balanced duels. Two skilled warriors, same weapons, same chances. That image is mostly wrong. The most common matches in the Colosseum were deeply unfair by design. Rome believed that imbalance made better entertainment. Watching an even fight was less exciting than watching a hopeless one. One of the most unfair matches involved condemned criminals. These men, sometimes women, were not gladiators at all. They were prisoners sentenced to death. They were brought into the arena with no training, no armor, and often no weapons. Sometimes they were forced to fight trained gladiators. Sometimes they were forced to face wild animals. Either way, survival was never expected. These executions were called damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. But beasts were only one option. In many cases, criminals were sent against gladiators who were fully trained, well-fed, and protected by armor. The result was predictable. The crowd did not come to see a contest, they came to see fear. Another deeply unfair match involved slaves captured in war. Rome constantly expanded its territory, and war produced prisoners in huge numbers. Some of these captives were trained as gladiators, but many were not. Newly captured slaves were sometimes thrown into the arena early, before training was complete, simply to fill the schedule. They fought experienced men while still weak, confused, and terrified. The crowd knew this. That knowledge was part of the pleasure. The Colosseum was not about surprise. It was about watching power crush weakness in a controlled, ritualized space. Even among trained gladiators, fairness was rare. Gladiators were divided into types called armatura. Each type used specific weapons and armor. On paper, these types were meant to balance each other. In reality, they were often matched unfairly on purpose. A heavily armored gladiator might be paired against a lightly armored one. A man with a short sword might be forced to fight someone with a long spear. A slow fighter might face a fast one. The mismatch created tension. The audience wanted to see whether skill could overcome disadvantage, or whether the imbalance would lead to a quick death. One of the most famous unfair matchups was between the retiarius and the secutor. The retiarius carried only a net, a trident, and a dagger. He wore almost no armor. His opponent, the secutor, was heavily armored with a helmet, shield, and sword. The retiarius relied on speed and distance. One mistake meant death. The secutor could absorb blows and keep advancing. This was not an equal fight. It was designed to look dangerous. The retiarius was meant to appear vulnerable, almost naked, constantly at risk. The audience could clearly see his fear, his breathing, his hesitation. That visibility made the fight more exciting. Some matches were unfair even before they began. Gladiators could be injured, sick, or exhausted and still forced to fight. Arena schedules were tight. Games lasted days. There was no concern for recovery. If a man survived yesterday, he might be sent out again today, weakened and slower. Food inequality also mattered. Not all fighters were fed equally. Some were deliberately underfed to weaken them. Others were given better food to increase their chances. The arena managers, called lanisti, controlled this. Their goal was not fairness, but profit and spectacle. The most extreme unfair matches involved animals. Gladiators trained to fight humans were sometimes forced to fight lions, bears, leopards, or bulls. Weapons designed for dueling were useless against claws and teeth. These fights were not contests. They were executions disguised as sport. Animals themselves were used unfairly too. Some were starved to make them aggressive. Others were injured beforehand. Rome did not care about balance. It cared about reaction, fear, blood, noise. Even the crowd played a role in unfairness. If the audience favored one fighter, the officials might subtly assist him. Weapons could be swapped. Signals could be given. Mercy could be denied or granted based on mood, not merit. The arena followed emotion, not rules. The Colosseum was a reflection of Roman society. Rome was hierarchical, unequal, ruthless. The arena made that hierarchy visible. Slaves died for citizens. Prisoners died for entertainment. Trained men died to prove Rome's dominance over chaos. No one entered the Colosseum expecting justice. Fighters entered knowing the odds were against someone. Often that someone was already chosen before the gates opened. And as the crowd settled, waiting for the first unfair match to begin, the sand below stood ready, not to show skill alone, but to absorb the cost of imbalance, written again and again in blood, for the pleasure of those watching above. As the gates of the Colosseum continued to open day after day, the unfairness of its matches became more deliberate, more organized, and more systematic. What looked like chaos to the crowd was, in reality, carefully managed imbalance. Roman officials understood that true equality inside the arena produced uncertainty, but not always excitement. Unfair matches, however, produced certainty. Certainty of fear, certainty of dominance, certainty of death. One of the clearest examples of this planned unfairness was the use of novice fighters against veterans. Gladiator schools trained men at different levels, but not all of them reached full readiness before being sent into the arena. Some were rushed forward because the schedule demanded bodies. Others were deliberately sacrificed to build the reputation of more valuable fighters. A seasoned gladiator defeating a weak opponent made the veteran look powerful and worth cheering. The novice existed only to be broken. These new fighters often entered the arena confused, overwhelmed by noise, light, and heat. They had practiced in controlled courtyards, not before tens of thousands of screaming spectators. Their movements were hesitant, their reactions slow. Against them stood men who had fought dozens of times, who understood how to perform fear, pain, and violence in a way the crowd appreciated. The outcome was rarely in doubt. Unfairness also appeared through weapon control. Weapons were not randomly assigned. Arena officials decided who received sharper blades, sturdier shields, or heavier armor. A fighter favored by the crowd or the sponsor of the games might receive better equipment. Another might receive a damaged helmet, a short blade, or a shield that restricted movement. These details mattered greatly in close combat. Some fighters were forced to fight with unfamiliar weapons. A man trained for years with a sword might suddenly be handed a spear. Another trained for speed might be burdened with heavy armor. This was not experimentation. It was deliberate disadvantage. Watching a skilled man struggle with unfamiliar tools added drama and unpredictability, even if it shortened his life. The arena also used fatigue as a weapon. Some matches were scheduled late in the day when fighters were already exhausted from heat, dehydration, and waiting underground for hours. Others were forced to fight multiple times in a single event. A man who survived an early bout might be sent back out later, wounded and slower, to face a fresh opponent. This was not accidental. It was calculated. Hydration and rest were controlled tightly. Fighters did not drink freely. Water was rationed. Food was simple and limited. A dehydrated, hungry body reacts slower. This created imbalance before a blade was even raised. Some fighters were kept deliberately hungry to reduce their strength and aggression. Another deeply unfair category involved theatrical executions disguised as myth. Condemned prisoners were dressed as characters from Roman legends and forced to reenact famous deaths. A man playing Icarus might be dropped from a platform. Another portraying Orpheus might be torn apart by animals. These victims had no weapons, no armor, and no chance. The crowd did not see them as people. They saw them as living props. These performances blurred the line between entertainment and punishment. The unfairness was total. The victims existed only to die in a visually pleasing way. Rome used culture and mythology to make brutality feel meaningful and justified. Animals were used to increase imbalance even further. Fighters trained for human combat were thrown against beasts that did not follow rules. Lions, leopards, bears, and bulls moved unpredictably. Weapons designed for duels failed against claws and teeth. Some fighters were tied, blinded, or wounded before animals were released. Survival was never expected. Animals themselves were also manipulated. Some were starved to increase aggression. Others were injured to make them weaker. Rome controlled both sides of the fight. Fairness mattered to neither animal nor human. Only spectacle mattered. Crowd influence played a major role in shaping unfair outcomes. The audience did not just watch, they judged. They shouted approval or disgust. Officials listened carefully. If the crowd favored one fighter, mercy might be granted. If the crowd disliked another, death was demanded. Skill did not guarantee survival. Popularity did. The emperor or sponsor of the games held ultimate power. A raised thumb or turned cloth could decide life or death, regardless of performance. Fighters knew this. They fought not only with weapons, but with gestures, eye contact, and displays of obedience. Even survival required submission. Political messages were embedded in these unfair matches. Rome displayed its enemies, criminals, and outsiders as weak, helpless, and disposable. Citizens watching from above were reminded of their privileged position. The arena taught hierarchy without words. The Colosseum was not a place where strength alone mattered. It was a place where power decided who deserved strength and who deserved destruction. Every unfair match reinforced Rome's worldview. Order over chaos, control over resistance, spectacle over justice. By the time the sand was soaked and the crowd satisfied, the imbalance had done its work. Rome had entertained itself, disciplined its population, and reminded everyone watching that life inside the empire was never equal. And as the gates closed and the bodies were dragged away, preparations quietly began for the next day's matches. New fighters, new victims, new unfair contests, waiting to unfold beneath the same towering stone walls. As the games continued across weeks and months, the unfairness of the Colosseum became something fighters learned to expect, long before they ever stepped onto the sand. By the time a man entered the arena, the outcome was often already shaped by decisions made far away from the crowd, in offices, training yards, and underground corridors where power operated quietly. Gladiator schools did not train fighters equally. Training itself was uneven, and this unevenness was intentional. Some men were marked early as valuable investments. They were given better instructors, more rest, and careful preparation. Others were trained only enough to be usable. These men were never meant to survive long. They existed to absorb damage, to lose dramatically, and to make others look impressive. The value of a gladiator was not based on fairness or merit alone. It was based on entertainment potential. A fighter who looked strong, exotic, or emotionally expressive could be worth more alive. A fighter who looked ordinary or broken could be sacrificed without regret. This calculation shaped matchups from the beginning. Unfairness also appeared through timing. Fighters were kept waiting underground for hours, sometimes all day, before being called into the arena. The underground holding areas were hot, dark, and crowded. Anxiety built slowly. Muscles stiffened. Hunger and thirst worsened. When a fighter was finally released into the blinding light and noise, his body was already compromised. Some fighters were deliberately released early in the day, when the crowd was restless and demanding blood quickly. Others were released later, when fatigue dulled reactions. Timing affected survival, and it was not random. The underground machinery of the Colosseum added another layer of imbalance. Elevators lifted fighters and animals suddenly into the arena. A man might be standing in darkness one moment and face a roaring crowd the next. There was no time to adjust. No time to prepare mentally. Shock itself became a weapon. In many cases, fighters did not know who or what they would face until the moment the gates opened. This uncertainty favored experienced veterans who had learned to control fear. Newer fighters froze, hesitated, or panicked. The crowd noticed immediately. Panic was punished. Unfairness was also enforced through rules that could change mid-fight. Officials held absolute authority. They could stop a fight, restart it, or allow it to continue despite injuries. A wounded fighter might beg for mercy and be ignored. Another might be spared instantly for no clear reason. Consistency was never promised. Some matches were designed to humiliate rather than kill. Fighters might be forced to fight blindfolded, chained, or with restricted movement. These matches reduced skill to nothing. The crowd laughed, shouted, and pointed. Humiliation became entertainment. Foreign captives were treated especially unfairly. Fighters from conquered regions were presented as outsiders, dressed differently, sometimes forced to fight in unfamiliar styles. Their deaths carried symbolic meaning. Rome was not just killing a man. It was killing a representative of a defeated culture. Women, though rare in the arena, faced extreme imbalance when they appeared. They were often given weaker equipment or placed against animals rather than humans. Their presence was meant to shock and excite, not to demonstrate skill. Survival was secondary to reaction. The crowd's expectations shaped unfairness constantly. Spectators did not want balanced contests every time. They wanted variety, surprise, fear. Sometimes that meant watching a skilled man overcome disadvantage. Sometimes it meant watching someone collapse quickly. Either way, fairness was flexible and expendable. Sponsors of the games used unfair matches to send messages. Executions during games reminded the public of the consequences of crime. Battles against beasts reminded them of Rome's power over nature. Mismatched duels reminded them that status mattered more than ability. Even victory could be unfair. A gladiator who won might still be executed if the crowd demanded it. Another might lose but be spared for reasons unrelated to skill. Survival was not proof of fairness. It was proof of favor. The physical aftermath of these unfair matches was brutal. Survivors carried injuries that never healed properly. Broken bones, deep cuts, internal damage. A man weakened by one unfair fight was more likely to lose the next. Unfairness compounded itself. Over time, fighters learned that the Colosseum was not something to conquer. It was something to endure. Strategy mattered less than luck. Skill mattered less than placement. Favor mattered more than strength. The arena taught this lesson relentlessly. No one entered expecting justice. They entered hoping not to be chosen as the weak one that day. Above them, the crowd continued to cheer, unaware or unconcerned with the machinery of imbalance beneath their feet. To them, the spectacle felt spontaneous. To Rome, it was carefully managed inequality, repeated again and again until it felt natural. And as the sand was raked smooth once more, the system reset. New matchups were prepared, new disadvantages assigned. The Colosseum stood ready to perform the same lesson again, in blood, under the open sky. As time passed, the unfairness of the Colosseum became more than a method of entertainment. It became a language. Through mismatched fights, Rome spoke to its population without words, teaching lessons about power, obedience, and inevitability. Every unequal match reinforced the idea that life inside the empire was governed not by justice, but by position. Behind the scenes, officials carefully shaped each event. The sponsor of the games, often a wealthy politician or the emperor himself, did not want uncertainty. Uncertainty risked disappointment. An uneven match reduced risk. When one side was clearly weaker, the outcome felt controlled. The crowd might not know exactly what would happen, but they knew someone would suffer. Records and inscriptions show that some fighters were marked as disposable. These men had little value beyond a single appearance. They were often paired against opponents who needed a victory to raise their reputation. The disposable fighter absorbed punishment, making the favored gladiator look skilled and heroic. This was not accidental cruelty. It was planned. Even medical care reinforced imbalance. Skilled and popular fighters received treatment after matches. Their wounds were cleaned, stitched, and monitored. Less valuable men were left to heal on their own, if they healed at all. An untreated injury weakened a fighter permanently. When he returned to the arena, the disadvantage followed him. Armor weight was another silent tool of unfairness. Some gladiators were forced to fight wearing armor heavier than usual, slowing them down. Others were given helmets that restricted vision or breathing. These small disadvantages became fatal over time. A slowed reaction or reduced sight meant one mistake, and one mistake meant death. The arena also manipulated space. Fighters could be released closer to animals or enemies, giving them less time to react. Some were forced to fight near barriers, limiting movement. Others were placed in open ground with no cover. Positioning shaped survival long before weapons clashed. Unfair matches also served a psychological purpose. Watching a weaker fighter struggle created tension. The crowd leaned forward. Would he survive? Would skill overcome imbalance? Most of the time, the answer was no. This reinforced a brutal lesson. Hope was fragile. Power decided outcomes. Rome used these moments to remind citizens of their own vulnerability. Just as fighters depended on favor, so did ordinary people. Laws could change. Punishments could be sudden. Mercy was not guaranteed. The arena made this clear without speeches. Foreign fighters continued to face extreme imbalance. Their unfamiliar fighting styles, languages, and customs made them seem less human to the crowd. When they lost unfairly, it confirmed Roman superiority. When they won, it was framed as an exception, not equality. Some matches were designed to end quickly. Others were designed to drag on painfully. A lightly armed man might be forced to evade a heavily armored opponent for long periods, exhausting himself before being struck down. Prolonged suffering created deeper emotional response. The crowd did not just watch death. They watched endurance collapse. Officials sometimes intervened mid-fight to restore imbalance if things went wrong. If an underdog began winning unexpectedly, weapons could be adjusted, animals released, or rules changed. The appearance of unpredictability was allowed. Actual unpredictability was not. Even the sand itself played a role. It absorbed blood, reduced traction, and slowed movement. Fighters learned quickly that slipping meant vulnerability. Those already disadvantaged struggled more. The arena floor was not neutral ground. It favored no one equally. Over years of games, this system refined itself. Unfairness became efficient. Matches delivered reliable emotional impact. The crowd became conditioned to imbalance. Fair fights began to feel boring by comparison. This conditioning mattered politically. A population entertained by controlled violence was easier to manage. The Colosseum distracted, disciplined, and educated all at once. It taught people where they stood in Rome's hierarchy. Fighters understood this deeply. They learned that survival depended less on courage than on favor. Appealing to the crowd, appealing to officials, appealing to sponsors. Performance mattered as much as combat. Some fighters tried to resist this system by refusing to beg, refusing to perform fear. These men rarely lasted long. The arena rewarded submission as much as strength. By the end of each event, the lesson was complete. Some men walked away alive. Many did not. The reasons were not always visible, but the pattern remained clear. The Colosseum was not built to test fairness. It was built to display power through imbalance, and as night fell once more, the arena emptied, silent again beneath the stars. Beneath the calm surface, plans were already forming for the next day's matches. New pairings, new disadvantages. The same ancient lesson, waiting to be written again in sand and blood. As the Colosseum continued to host games year after year, unfair matches became more refined, more intentional, and more deeply woven into Rome's political and social machinery. These contests were no longer simply violent entertainment. They were tools. Tools used to shape public emotion, reinforce loyalty, and quietly remind the population who held control over life itself. The sponsor of the games, whether an ambitious politician or the emperor, understood that the arena was a stage larger than any forum speech. A fair fight produced uncertainty. An unfair fight produced a message. When a clearly weaker fighter was crushed, the crowd felt the weight of inevitability. When mercy was granted unexpectedly, gratitude replaced doubt. Both reactions served power. This is why unfair matches never disappeared. They worked too well. Crowd psychology played a crucial role. Spectators arrived carrying frustration, hunger, and resentment from daily life. The arena redirected those emotions safely away from authority. Watching a helpless man struggle and fall allowed the crowd to release anger without threatening the state. The unfairness was not accidental. It was therapeutic, in a dark, controlled way. The audience learned to recognize imbalance immediately. A fighter's armor, posture, and confidence revealed his fate within moments. This created anticipation. Would the weaker man break quickly, or would he resist longer than expected? Even resistance became part of the spectacle. A doomed fighter who struggled bravely gave the crowd a sense of earned satisfaction when death finally came. Officials understood how to stretch this tension. They controlled pacing carefully. A man might be wounded early but not allowed to die immediately. He might be forced to crawl, bleed, and fight on. Prolonged suffering deepened emotional investment. The longer the struggle, the louder the reaction when it ended. This manipulation of time was critical. Fast deaths shocked, slow deaths educated. The idea of deserving death was central to Roman thinking. Criminals, rebels, and outsiders were framed as morally inferior. Unfair matches reinforced this belief visually. If someone died easily, it was seen as proof they were weak or unworthy. If someone endured, it was admired but rarely rewarded. Survival never erased status. Some unfair matches were designed specifically to humiliate. Fighters might be stripped of armor, mocked by announcers, or forced into ridiculous costumes. The crowd laughed. Laughter removed empathy. Once empathy was gone, violence felt easier to accept. The Colosseum also reinforced gender and social norms. Men were expected to endure pain without complaint. Those who begged too early were despised. Those who begged too late were ignored. There was no correct moment. Mercy depended entirely on mood and favor, not behavior. Foreign fighters were often given exaggerated disadvantages to reinforce Roman superiority. Their deaths symbolized conquest. Their suffering reminded citizens of Rome's reach. Even when these fighters displayed courage, it was framed as exotic or surprising, never equal. The unfairness extended to memory. Fighters who died poorly were forgotten quickly. Fighters who died well might be remembered briefly. Fighters who won unfairly gained fame, but only as long as they continued to entertain. Reputation itself was unstable and controlled. Inside the arena, rules were flexible. Outside the arena, their impact was lasting. The population internalized the idea that fairness was optional and conditional. That lesson extended beyond entertainment. It shaped how people viewed law, punishment, and authority. The Colosseum taught that power did not need to justify itself. It only needed to display itself convincingly. For the fighters, this knowledge was devastating. Training no longer focused solely on skill. It focused on survival strategies that had nothing to do with combat. how to fall convincingly without dying, how to bleed without collapsing, how to look dangerous without provoking immediate execution. These techniques were passed quietly from veteran to novice. Some fighters learned to exaggerate weakness early, encouraging overconfidence in opponents. Others learned to beg theatrically, playing to the crowd's emotions. These were adaptations to unfairness, not solutions to it. The arena rewarded those who understood performance. A fighter who fought efficiently but without drama risked death. A fighter who turned suffering into spectacle stood a better chance of mercy. This inversion of values distorted combat completely. Over time, unfair matches also protected the arena economy. Starfighters were preserved. Disposable men were rotated endlessly. Death became predictable, manageable, and profitable. The system fed itself. Even disasters reinforced unfairness. When accidents occurred, when animals escaped control or mechanisms failed, officials reacted by restoring imbalance quickly. Additional fighters were thrown in, rules were abandoned, order had to be reasserted, no matter the cost. The Colosseum never pretended to be just. It pretended to be magnificent. Magnificence did not require fairness. It required obedience, spectacle, and repetition. By the end of each season of games, the population had absorbed the lesson once more. Life was not equal. Survival was conditional. Favor mattered more than merit. And as Rome moved forward, the sand was swept clean again. New fighters arrived. New victims waited underground. The same machinery of unfairness prepared to perform once more, uninterrupted, beneath the towering stone walls that had witnessed it all countless times before. As the Colosseum remained active year after year, the unfairness of its matches stopped being a hidden feature and became the very foundation on which the entire system rested. Nothing inside the arena functioned by accident anymore. Every imbalance, every disadvantage, every hopeless pairing was part of a structure refined through repetition. Rome did not merely tolerate unfair fights. It depended on them. By this stage, the arena had developed a predictable rhythm. The audience arrived already understanding that someone would be sacrificed. They did not ask who deserved to win. They asked who would suffer most memorably. This expectation shaped everything that followed. Organizers planned matches backward from the emotional result they wanted, then selected fighters accordingly. Fairness never entered the calculation. One of the most common forms of structural unfairness was controlled inevitability. Certain matches were designed so that survival was technically possible, but practically unreachable. A lightly armed fighter might be placed against a heavily armored opponent with superior reach, strength, and experience. On paper, there was a chance. In reality, the weaker man's role was to delay the ending just long enough to satisfy the crowd. These men learned quickly that resistance did not always improve survival. Prolonged struggle often led to harsher deaths. A fast collapse disappointed the crowd. A slow collapse exhausted them. The fighter was trapped between two losing outcomes, neither of which offered dignity or control. Rome also used exhaustion as an invisible weapon. Fighters were often marched long distances before games. They slept poorly underground. Food was limited. Water was controlled. By the time they reached the arena floor, their bodies were already compromised. A well-fed, rested fighter facing an exhausted opponent was not witnessing chance. He was benefiting from design. This imbalance extended to mental fatigue as well. The psychological strain of waiting beneath the arena was extreme. Fighters listened to screams above them. They heard animals being released. They smelled blood. They knew exactly what awaited them, but not when. This uncertainty broke weaker minds before combat even began. Veterans learned to compartmentalize. Novices did not. The Colosseum also perfected visual imbalance. Fighters who were meant to lose were dressed differently. Their armor might be simpler, their weapons smaller, their posture less confident. The audience could often tell who was marked for death before the fight began. This anticipation heightened excitement. The crowd felt involved in the outcome before the first blow landed. Officials encouraged this by exaggerating contrast. A powerful fighter would be presented dramatically. A weaker one might be rushed in with little ceremony. This framing taught the audience who to support and who to discard emotionally. Once empathy was removed, killing became easier to watch. Unfairness also functioned as discipline within the gladiator schools. Fighters who disobeyed orders, resisted training, or caused trouble could be punished through match placement. Being assigned an unwinnable fight was the ultimate warning. Survival was uncertain. Death was likely. Others learned quickly to obey. In this way, the arena enforced order not just publicly but internally. Gladiators did not need chains constantly. Fear of unfair matches was enough to maintain control. Political messaging intensified this system. During times of unrest, more executions were staged, more hopeless fights, more criminals, rebels, and outsiders were displayed as powerless. The crowd absorbed the message without speeches. Resistance leads to humiliation and death. Order is absolute. Even mercy became unfair. Mercy was not granted based on effort or bravery. It was granted based on usefulness. A fighter who could generate future profit might be spared. Another equally brave man might be killed because his survival offered nothing to the system. This randomness destroyed the idea that behavior influenced outcomes. Over time, fighters stopped believing in justice entirely. They believed in timing, favor, and performance. Skill mattered, but only within boundaries set by others. No amount of training could overcome a match designed to eliminate you. Some fighters tried to sabotage themselves to avoid worse fates, minor injuries, feigned illness. These tactics sometimes delayed execution, but rarely prevented it. The system always found another way to extract value. The arena also taught the public to accept inequality as natural. If trained fighters could be crushed unfairly, then ordinary citizens understood their own vulnerability. The Colosseum normalized the idea that power decided outcomes, not fairness. This lesson extended far beyond entertainment. It shaped how Romans viewed law, punishment, and authority. Justice became flexible. Mercy became optional. Survival became conditional. The Colosseum did not hide this truth. It displayed it openly, repeatedly, and with ceremony. The unfair match was Rome's most honest performance. By the end of each day, the sand told the story clearly. Some men were allowed to live. Many were not. The reasons were rarely visible, but the pattern was unmistakable. Life inside Rome was never equal, and the arena ensured no one forgot that. As night fell and the crowd dispersed, the Colosseum returned to silence. Beneath that silence, preparations continued. New fighters arrived. New disadvantages were planned. New outcomes were decided long before the gates opened again. The unfair match was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. As the Colosseum continued to dominate Roman life, the unfairness inside it began to feel permanent, almost natural, both to those who watched and to those who fought. What had once been shocking slowly became routine. People stopped questioning why some men were clearly sent to die while others were protected. The imbalance was no longer noticed, because it was expected. This acceptance was one of the most powerful outcomes the arena ever produced. By this stage, the Colosseum functioned like a machine that processed human lives. Fighters entered at different points in that machine. Some entered near the center, where survival was possible for a time. Others entered at the edge, where death was almost immediate. The placement was never random. Records, reputation, usefulness, and obedience all determined how far a man was allowed to go. The most extreme unfairness was often invisible to the crowd. Long before a match, decisions were made about who would be allowed to live. A popular gladiator might be quietly protected, even during a losing fight. Officials could signal opponents to slow down, prolong the fight, or avoid lethal blows. At the same time, a disposable fighter might be quietly marked for death no matter how well he performed. The crowd believed it was watching chance. In reality, it was watching choreography disguised as chaos. Injuries were another hidden layer of imbalance. Fighters entered the arena carrying wounds from previous matches that never fully healed. Broken fingers, cracked ribs, damaged joints, internal bleeding. Medical care existed, but it was uneven. Valuable fighters were treated carefully. Others were patched quickly and sent back out before their bodies were ready. Pain became cumulative. Each unfair match weakened a man further, making the next one even more unequal. The psychological damage was just as severe. Living under constant awareness that fairness did not exist broke many fighters long before death. Some stopped resisting. Others became reckless, hoping for a quick end rather than prolonged suffering. The arena crushed not only bodies but expectation itself. Once hope disappeared, survival became a mechanical act. The Colosseum also perfected the use of contrast. A strong, confident fighter entering after a terrified, wounded one created an immediate visual hierarchy. The crowd responded instantly. Cheers followed strength. Silence followed weakness. This reaction reinforced the imbalance. Fighters could feel the crowd's judgment before the fight even began. Foreign fighters suffered this contrast most sharply. Their language, appearance, and fighting style marked them as outsiders. When they lost unfairly, the loss felt symbolic. Rome defeating the world again and again. When they won, it was treated as novelty, not proof of equality. The system absorbed exceptions without changing its message. Even victories could be unfair in quieter ways. A fighter might win repeatedly, only to be placed in a hopeless match later because his popularity peaked. Once a gladiator's value was extracted fully, the system had no reason to protect him. Fame delayed death. It did not prevent it. Crowd emotion was carefully guided to accept this. Announcers framed matches with language that implied destiny. Certain fighters were described as brave but doomed. Others were praised as unstoppable. These narratives shaped how deaths were received. A man who died as expected barely registered. A man who resisted too long was punished more harshly to restore order. The arena also erased accountability. No single person was responsible for death. Sponsors blamed tradition. Officials blamed the crowd. The crowd blamed fate. This diffusion of responsibility allowed extreme unfairness to continue without resistance. Everyone participated. No one felt fully guilty. Over time, this constant exposure to controlled inequality reshaped Roman values. People learned to admire power more than fairness. Survival seemed less about justice and more about alignment with authority. The Colosseum was a daily lesson in how Rome truly worked. Fighters who survived long enough understood this deeply. They stopped thinking like warriors and started thinking like performers trapped inside a rigid system. Their goal was not to win fairly. It was to avoid being selected as the sacrifice that day. That alone was considered success. As seasons passed, the Colosseum did not grow more violent. It grew more efficient. Fewer surprises, better planning, cleaner outcomes. Unfairness became predictable, and predictability made the system stable. By the time night fell and the crowd left once again, the arena stood quiet, its lessons already absorbed. Tomorrow, the same structure would repeat. New men would be placed into old roles. Some would be protected, some would be broken. Most would never understand why. This was the true legacy of the Colosseum's unfair matches. Not just death, but normalization. Inequality made visible so often that it stopped looking like cruelty and started looking like order. As the Colosseum settled deeper into Roman routine, the unfairness within it stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like structure. The arena was no longer simply a place where unfair things happened. It was a place built to produce inequality on demand, reliably and endlessly. Every stone wall, corridor, gate, and rule supported this outcome without ever needing to say so aloud. By now, most spectators understood instinctively that not every fighter entered the arena with the same purpose. Some were meant to test skill, some were meant to display dominance, others were meant to disappear. The audience rarely questioned this. They judged only whether the suffering was convincing enough, whether the performance held their attention long enough, whether the ending felt satisfying. The underground system beneath the Colosseum reinforced this hierarchy silently. Fighters waited in separate holding areas based on status. Popular gladiators were kept apart, calmer, better fed, better guarded. Others were crowded together, listening to screams echo through the stone corridors. Even before entering the arena, inequality was enforced physically. Guards treated fighters differently as well. Favored men were spoken to calmly. Disfavored ones were pushed, hurried, or ignored. Small gestures reminded everyone where they stood. These moments shaped confidence, fear, and posture long before weapons were raised. A man who already felt disposable fought like one. Unfairness also appeared through ritual delay. Some fighters were left waiting while others died. They heard the crowd react. They felt time stretch unnaturally. Anxiety built slowly, draining energy. When their turn finally came, their bodies were already shaking. This delay was not accidental. It softened resistance. When fighters entered the arena, the imbalance continued through space and movement. Some were released closer to enemies. Others were forced to cross open ground under full view of the crowd. The longer walk increased fear and exposure. The audience watched every step. Confidence or hesitation became part of the judgment before combat began. The sand itself worked against fairness. Blood made it slick. Movement became uncertain. A tired or wounded fighter slipped more easily. Once on the ground, recovery was difficult. Standing again took time, and time meant vulnerability. Fighters who already carried disadvantages suffered most here. Officials closely monitored these moments. If a fight risked becoming too balanced, intervention followed. An animal might be released. A second opponent added. A weapon adjusted. The goal was not chaos but restoration of hierarchy. Balance was corrected immediately. This constant adjustment taught the crowd to expect inequality. A fair fight that dragged on without clear advantage felt wrong. The audience grew restless. Shouts increased. Officials responded by accelerating imbalance. The system trained spectators as much as fighters. The psychological effect on the public was profound. Watching unfairness repeatedly made it feel normal. People stopped seeing injustice and started seeing order. This shaped how Romans viewed authority outside the arena. If inequality felt natural in the Colosseum, it felt natural everywhere else. For fighters, this realization arrived slowly and painfully. Many entered the arena believing courage or discipline could protect them. Over time, survivors learned that awareness mattered more than bravery. Knowing when you were chosen to lose mattered more than how well you fought. Some fighters learned to read subtle signs. The way officials avoided eye contact. The way opponents were positioned. The tone of the announcer's voice. These signs told experienced men whether survival was possible that day. Younger fighters missed them and paid the price. The unfairness also shaped silence. Fighters stopped asking questions. Questions suggested resistance. Resistance brought punishment. Acceptance increased survival slightly. This silence spread through the schools, reinforcing obedience without force. Rome's leadership understood this dynamic perfectly. The arena was not meant to inspire rebellion. It was meant to exhaust it. Watching controlled violence daily drained anger from the population and redirected it toward approved targets. Criminals, outsiders, the unlucky. Over time, unfair matches became more than entertainment. They became instruction. Citizens learned where power lived. Fighters learned where it did not. The lesson was consistent and unforgettable. As evening approached and the final bodies were removed, the arena floor was smoothed once again. The sand hid evidence. The structure remained untouched. Nothing needed to change. The system was working exactly as intended. Tomorrow, new fighters would stand beneath the same walls. New disadvantages would be assigned. New lessons would be taught through imbalance. The Colosseum would continue its work quietly, efficiently, without ever claiming to be fair. As this system of imbalance continued without interruption, the Colosseum began to shape not only events inside its walls, but the mindset of an entire society. Unfair matches were no longer perceived as cruel exceptions. They became proof that the world functioned exactly as Rome believed it should. Power existed to be displayed. Weakness existed to be exposed. The arena made this philosophy visible in the most direct way possible. By now, fighters understood that survival depended less on strength than on placement within the system. A man could train for years, sharpen his skill, and still be destroyed in seconds if he was assigned the wrong role. This knowledge spread quietly among gladiators, passed in whispers, gestures, and warnings that never reached the crowd above. The arena floor became a space where truth was experienced but never spoken. Unfairness also extended into reputation management. Gladiators who gained popularity were sometimes deliberately placed in easier matches to extend their careers. Their victories created familiarity. Familiarity created loyalty. Loyalty kept crowds returning. At the same time, lesser-known fighters were sacrificed to preserve these figures. Fame itself became a shield, thin but valuable. This created a distorted form of hierarchy among fighters. Skill alone did not define rank. Survival did. Those who lasted longer were assumed to be superior, even when their survival depended on protection rather than merit. The crowd rarely questioned this. Longevity looked like proof of greatness. The arena also relied heavily on predictable loss. Some matches were meant to reassure the audience that Rome remained in control. When social tension rose, more executions were staged, more hopeless pairings, more rapid deaths. These matches did not entertain so much as stabilize. They reminded spectators that authority was firm and resistance pointless. This function mattered deeply during periods of instability. When food shortages, political conflict, or disease threatened unrest, the Colosseum responded with brutality disguised as tradition. Violence became distraction. Unfairness became reassurance. The fighters chosen for these moments were rarely random. Prisoners, rebels, and marginalized groups were displayed as powerless. Their deaths were symbolic. They absorbed public anger so that it did not rise upward. The physical design of the Colosseum supported this function perfectly. The distance between audience and arena created emotional separation. Spectators saw suffering without smelling blood closely, without hearing breath fade slowly. This distance made unfairness easier to accept. The victims felt abstract. The lesson felt clear. Inside the arena, time slowed. A single fight might feel endless to the man inside it. To the crowd, it was only a segment of a larger spectacle. This difference in experience deepened imbalance. Fighters lived moments the audience consumed casually. The sound of the crowd itself influenced outcomes. Cheers emboldened some fighters. Silence crushed others. Officials listened carefully. Crowd energy guided decisions. If boredom crept in, imbalance increased. More danger, more blood, more urgency. Over time, this feedback loop refined itself. The Colosseum learned how much unfairness was required to maintain attention without provoking discomfort. Death was normalized but not so constant that it lost impact. Suffering was calibrated. For fighters, this meant uncertainty never disappeared. Even after years of survival, a man could be assigned a hopeless match without warning. No contract protected him. No reputation guaranteed safety. Survival always remained conditional. This conditional existence reshaped how fighters viewed life itself. Planning beyond the next match felt pointless. Long-term hope faded. Focus narrowed to immediate survival. The arena reduced lives to moments measured by breath and movement. Some fighters tried to resist internally by clinging to identity, memory, or pride. Most eventually let go. The system rewarded emptiness. A man who expected nothing suffered less. This emotional withdrawal was another victory for the arena. The crowd never saw this inner collapse. They saw only performance, blood, motion, endings. The unfairness remained invisible because it was structural, not dramatic. It operated quietly, relentlessly, beneath every match. By the end of each day, Rome felt satisfied. The crowd returned home feeling entertained, reassured, and strangely calm. The violence had done its work. The imbalance had been accepted once more. And as night settled over the Colosseum, the silence inside its walls was heavy. The sand was smoothed again. The mechanisms reset. The same structure waited patiently for the next day, ready to produce inequality on demand. The unfair match was no longer an act. It was a process that trained fighters to obey, trained citizens to accept hierarchy, and trained the empire to sustain itself through controlled injustice, repeated endlessly under the open sky. As the Colosseum's routines hardened into tradition, unfairness became so embedded that even the people who managed the games no longer described it as manipulation. To them, it was logistics, a system for moving bodies, emotions, and expectations efficiently through a single space. The arena was not concerned with who deserved to win. It was concerned with maintaining momentum, order, and impact. At this stage, the planning of unfair matches resembled administration more than cruelty. Lists were drawn, names were ranked, fighters were categorized by usefulness, popularity, obedience, and remaining lifespan. Some men were considered renewable resources, others were considered finished. Placement followed these quiet classifications. This meant that a fighter's fate could change suddenly. A man who survived several matches might wake one morning to find himself reassigned, no longer protected. Perhaps the crowd's interest had faded. Perhaps a new favorite had appeared. Perhaps the sponsor needed a dramatic death to conclude the day's events. The reasons were rarely personal, but the outcome always was. The arena also exploited contrast across the day. Early matches often featured weaker or condemned fighters, setting a baseline of brutality. As the day progressed, stronger fighters appeared, restoring excitement. This structure made later victories feel earned, even when they were carefully engineered. The unfairness of early deaths prepared the audience emotionally to accept later outcomes without questioning them. This sequencing mattered. By the time skilled gladiators entered, the crowd had already accepted death as normal. Violence no longer shocked. It entertained. Within that atmosphere, even moderate imbalance felt invisible. The Colosseum's officials were highly sensitive to shifts in audience mood. If attention wandered, they escalated unfairness. More animals, fewer weapons, tighter restrictions. The goal was never equality. The goal was reaction. Silence was failure. Noise was success. Inside the arena, fighters sensed these shifts instinctively. They could feel when the crowd wanted blood quickly and when it wanted a prolonged struggle. This awareness shaped behavior. Some fighters fought defensively to delay. Others took risks to end things fast. None of these choices restored fairness. They only navigated imbalance. The structure also encouraged sacrifice through symbolism. Certain days were dedicated to honoring victories, gods, or political milestones. On these days, deaths carried meaning beyond entertainment. Prisoners were executed publicly to reinforce loyalty. Outsiders were crushed to display dominance. These matches were the most unfair of all, because their outcomes were fixed from the beginning. In such moments, resistance became almost irrelevant. A fighter might perform perfectly and still be killed because the narrative demanded it. The crowd wanted closure, not justice. The arena delivered. This predictability did not reduce fear among fighters. It intensified it. Knowing that skill could not protect you removed the illusion of control. Many fighters entered the arena already resigned to death. This resignation shaped posture, movement, and decision-making. The body followed the mind into collapse. Rome did not see this as tragedy. It saw it as order. The Colosseum demonstrated that individuals existed within systems larger than themselves. Personal excellence mattered only when it aligned with those systems. Otherwise, it was erased. The audience absorbed this lesson repeatedly. Over time, people learned not to expect fairness from power. They learned to navigate authority rather than challenge it. This mindset extended into daily life. Legal decisions, social rank, and political outcomes all mirrored the logic of the arena. The Colosseum thus functioned as rehearsal for reality. What happened on the sand reflected what happened in courts, markets, and streets. Inequality was not an exception. It was the rule. By this point in history, unfair matches no longer required justification. They were tradition. Tradition does not argue. It repeats. Each repetition strengthened acceptance. Each acceptance deepened control. As the sun lowered and shadows stretched across the arena floor, the final matches of the day played out with familiar precision. Some men fell quickly, some endured longer. The reasons were known only to those in charge. The crowd reacted on cue. When the gates finally closed and the audience drifted away, the Colosseum stood unchanged. Its walls held the memory of thousands of unequal contests, layered one atop another, forming a legacy of imbalance so complete that it felt permanent. Tomorrow the same structure would awaken again. New fighters would be sorted. New outcomes would be arranged. The unfair match would continue doing what it had always done, quietly teaching Rome how power truly worked. As the Colosseum moved deeper into its long life, the unfairness of its matches stopped being a feature of specific events and became a constant condition of existence for everyone involved. Fighters, officials, and spectators all operated inside this condition without naming it. The arena no longer needed explanation. It simply functioned day after day, reinforcing the same lesson through repetition rather than surprise. By this stage, most fighters understood that the arena was not testing who was strongest or most skilled. It was testing who could endure uncertainty the longest. Survival depended on navigating invisible forces rather than visible opponents. A man could read his enemy's movements, but he could not read the intentions of the officials, the mood of the crowd, or the political needs of the sponsor. These unseen elements carried more weight than any weapon. The Colosseum refined its use of anticipation as a tool of imbalance. Fighters often waited underground long after their scheduled time. The delay itself drained energy and focus. Muscles cooled, fear settled in, thoughts spiraled. When the gates finally opened, the body was already compromised. This made even a technically fair matchup uneven in practice. Unfairness also extended into how defeats were framed. When a favored fighter won easily, his victory was celebrated as proof of excellence. When an unfavored fighter lost quickly, his death was dismissed as weakness. The same outcome could be interpreted in opposite ways depending on who benefited. The narrative always supported the existing hierarchy. Officials maintained this hierarchy carefully. They tracked crowd reactions closely. A fighter who inspired sympathy might be spared temporarily, but only if his survival served the spectacle. Sympathy itself was managed. Too much empathy risked discomfort. Too little risked boredom. The arena balanced emotions as precisely as it balanced matchups. Even training became shaped by unfairness. Gladiator schools prepared fighters not for equality, but for unpredictability. Veterans taught novices how to fall in ways that avoided fatal blows, how to bleed without collapsing, how to move just slowly enough to appear weakened but not helpless. These skills were survival tools in an environment where fairness could not be trusted. The Colosseum also relied on contrast between hope and inevitability. Occasionally, a disadvantaged fighter was allowed to win. These rare victories reinforced belief in possibility. They made the system feel flexible. But these moments were exceptions designed to protect the rule. For every surprise survival, countless quiet deaths reinforced the underlying imbalance. This pattern affected how Romans understood fate. Fate was not random. It was administered. People learned to see outcomes as the result of alignment rather than merit. Being favored mattered more than being right. This lesson extended beyond the arena into politics, law, and social life. The unfairness of the Colosseum also shaped silence. Families of fallen fighters rarely protested. There was nothing to protest against. The system had not broken a rule. It had followed one. Grief existed privately, while acceptance ruled publicly. Over time, the arena's logic became internalized. People adjusted expectations downward. Justice became something hoped for, not demanded. Survival became something negotiated, not earned. The Colosseum did not teach despair. It taught adaptation. Fighters who lasted long enough learned to detach emotionally. Detachment reduced fear. Reduced fear improved performance. Improved performance sometimes extended life. This emotional numbing was not strength. It was a response to structural unfairness. The audience, too, became emotionally conditioned. Watching unequal matches repeatedly dulled shock. Violence became rhythm. Suffering became background. The arena trained people to observe pain without reacting deeply. This made authority easier to maintain. As another day ended, the arena emptied once again. Beneath the stone arches, the mechanisms rested briefly. Above ground, Rome returned to its routines, carrying the lessons of the sand with it unconsciously. Nothing dramatic needed to happen anymore. The system was stable. The unfair match no longer required effort. It ran itself through habit, expectation, and acceptance. And so the Colosseum continued, not as a place of chaos, but as a place of order defined by imbalance. A place where inequality was not hidden, but displayed so often that it stopped being questioned, becoming instead one of the most familiar truths of Roman life. As the Colosseum's rhythm continued uninterrupted, unfairness stopped feeling like an active decision and started feeling like the natural state of things. This was perhaps the most powerful transformation of all. When inequality becomes routine, it no longer needs enforcement. It enforces itself. Fighters entered the arena already expecting imbalance. Spectators arrived already prepared to accept it. Officials operated without needing to justify it. The system had completed its work. By this point, the Colosseum no longer relied on shock to hold attention. Shock fades quickly. Instead, it relied on familiar tension. The crowd knew someone would be placed at a disadvantage. They watched to see how long that person would last. The suspense came not from who would win, but from when collapse would arrive. This shift made unfairness essential to entertainment. A fair fight removed the certainty that made anticipation possible. Fighters internalized this logic deeply. Many stopped preparing emotionally for victory. Preparation focused on endurance, pain tolerance, managing fear. The question was no longer, can I win? But how long can I survive today? This narrowing of expectation reduced resistance. It made fighters easier to manage, easier to place, easier to sacrifice when needed. The Colosseum's structure rewarded this mindset. Fighters who resisted too strongly or displayed defiance were punished through placement. A rebellious fighter might be assigned a hopeless match as a warning to others. Survival itself became conditional on compliance. The arena did not need constant violence to enforce obedience. The threat of unfairness was enough. This threat extended beyond fighters. Trainers, attendants, and guards all operated under the same understanding. Speaking out against decisions was pointless. Complaints led nowhere. Silence ensured survival. The entire workforce of the arena adapted to imbalance in the same way gladiators did. By accepting it, unfairness also shaped memory. Fighters who died quickly were forgotten almost immediately. Fighters who died slowly were remembered briefly. Fighters who survived repeatedly became legends, even if their survival was engineered. History remembered outcomes, not conditions. The imbalance that shaped those outcomes faded from view. This selective memory helped Rome preserve the myth of merit. Exceptional survivors were used as proof that success was possible. Their existence justified the system, even though it depended on countless unseen deaths. The rare victory protected the many losses. The arena also perfected the use of emotional pacing. Officials learned exactly how many unfair matches the crowd could tolerate before discomfort appeared. They spaced deaths carefully. A brutal execution followed by a controlled duel. A hopeless fight followed by a dramatic survival. This rhythm kept spectators engaged without overwhelming them. Animals continued to play a key role in maintaining imbalance. Human fighters never truly adapted to fighting beasts. This ensured unpredictability without fairness. A trained man facing a wild animal always carried a disadvantage that skill could not fully overcome. These matches reminded everyone that power did not need to be fair to be effective. The Colosseum also manipulated visibility. Fighters meant to be sacrificed were often placed in clear view, center stage, under full sunlight. Their suffering was meant to be seen clearly. Favored fighters were sometimes allowed shadows, angles, or distance. Visibility itself became a weapon. As time passed, these practices became tradition. People stopped asking why certain matches existed. They asked only whether the games were good that day. Quality replaced morality. Entertainment replaced evaluation. This shift mattered deeply. A society that judges violence by quality rather than fairness is easier to control. The Colosseum trained Rome to think this way repeatedly, publicly, and without resistance. For fighters nearing the end of their lives, the unfairness became almost abstract. Some stopped fearing death and feared irrelevance more. A quick death meant nothing. A prolonged, visible struggle meant being noticed. In a system where survival was uncertain, being seen became its own reward. The arena fed this desperation. It allowed just enough visibility to keep fighters performing, but never enough to change their fate. Hope was permitted, but only in small, controlled doses. As another cycle of games drew toward its close, Nothing changed structurally. The same rules applied, the same imbalances repeated, the same lessons were reinforced. The Colosseum did not evolve away from unfairness. It evolved deeper into it, and so the arena stood firm, not as a place of random cruelty, but as a perfectly tuned mechanism for producing inequality on demand. A place where unfairness was not a failure of the system, but its most reliable output. The matches would continue. The imbalance would persist. And Rome, watching from above, would continue to learn what power looked like when it no longer felt the need to pretend to be fair. As this system matured, the unfairness of the Colosseum stopped producing outrage even in those who might once have questioned it. What replaced outrage was familiarity. Familiarity dulled judgment. When something is seen often enough, the mind stops evaluating it and starts categorizing it as normal. This is how the arena maintained itself for centuries without reform. Not through fear alone, but through repetition. By now, the Colosseum had created an environment where expectation replaced morality. Spectators did not ask whether a match should exist. They asked whether it would be memorable. Fighters did not ask whether a pairing was just. They asked whether survival was possible. Officials did not ask whether imbalance was excessive. They asked whether the crowd would respond. Each group operated within its own narrow logic, and together these logics reinforced one another perfectly. The unfairness became self-correcting. When a match appeared too even, interest dipped. When interest dipped, officials intervened. More danger was added, more disadvantage introduced. The system adjusted automatically, like a living mechanism that responded to boredom rather than conscience. In this way, unfairness was not imposed from above every time. It was demanded from below. The audience played an active role in sustaining imbalance. Spectators learned to read cues quickly. A man released with poor armor. Another released with superior position. The crowd leaned forward instinctively. They knew what was coming. Their anticipation fueled the outcome. The fighter marked for loss could feel this attention pressing down on him before the fight even began. This pressure altered behavior. Fighters destined to lose often fought cautiously, conserving energy, hoping for mercy. Fighters expected to win fought aggressively, confident in protection. These expectations became self-fulfilling. Confidence and fear were not evenly distributed. The arena ensured that imbalance existed not only in weapons, but in minds. Unfairness also shaped how pain was displayed. Fighters learned that pain could be useful. Showing pain too early invited ridicule. Showing pain too late invited execution. The correct display lay somewhere in between, and finding it required experience few survived long enough to gain. This meant that newer fighters, already disadvantaged, faced an additional layer of risk. Their inexperience made them vulnerable not just physically, but theatrically. The Colosseum also refined the use of interruption. A fight might be stopped abruptly just as momentum shifted. A wounded fighter might be denied a finishing blow. Another might be forced to continue despite obvious defeat. These interruptions prevented any sense of fairness from developing. Outcomes remained controlled, detached from performance. This detachment mattered politically. It reminded spectators that results were not negotiated through effort. They were granted. Authority, not merit, decided endings. The arena thus reinforced obedience subtly, without explicit command. Unfairness extended even into death itself. Bodies were removed quickly. Names were rarely spoken. The speed of removal minimized reflection. The crowd moved on to the next match before empathy could settle. This pacing protected the system. Slow reflection threatened acceptance. Speed preserved it. Over time, the arena taught people to separate suffering from responsibility. Suffering happened. Responsibility was abstract. No one felt accountable. This moral distance allowed cruelty to function efficiently. The fighters most damaged by this system were not always those who died quickly. Those who survived multiple unfair matches carried long-term damage. Physical, emotional, psychological. They lived with constant uncertainty. Survival felt temporary. Planning felt dangerous. Many stopped imagining a future entirely. This mental narrowing served the arena well. Fighters who could not imagine escape were easier to manage. They focused inward, not outward. Resistance faded naturally. The Colosseum also shaped how outsiders were viewed. Prisoners, foreigners, and rebels were framed visually as weaker, smaller, less capable. Their unfair defeats reinforced stereotypes that justified conquest and punishment elsewhere in the empire. The arena was propaganda made physical. As years passed, the unfair match became the standard by which other forms of entertainment were judged. Balance felt dull. Excess felt necessary. The Colosseum trained Roman taste itself, teaching the population what to enjoy and what to ignore. This training extended beyond violence. It influenced how Romans consumed stories, speeches, and public events. Dramatic imbalance captured attention. Subtlety faded. The arena reshaped cultural appetite. And still, beneath all of this, the mechanism remained unchanged. Fighters were sorted, advantages assigned, outcomes guided. The system required no reinvention. It repeated because repetition worked. As another cycle of games moved forward, the Colosseum stood unchanged, its walls holding centuries of unequal contests layered invisibly upon one another. Each new unfair match added weight to this history, deepening a structure already too familiar to notice. The arena did not need to explain itself. It did not need to defend itself. It simply continued, producing inequality with the same reliability it produced spectacle, teaching Rome, again and again, that fairness was optional, but control was permanent. As the Colosseum moved through decades and generations, the unfairness inside it began to feel timeless, as if it had always existed and always would. People who entered the arena as children later returned as adults with the same expectations, the same acceptance, and the same emotional conditioning. The system did not need renewal. It sustained itself by shaping memory and habit. By this point, unfair matches had become a form of social education. Children sitting beside parents learned without explanation how power behaved. They learned that strength did not guarantee survival. They learned that mercy was unpredictable. They learned that authority decided outcomes, not effort. These lessons were absorbed long before they could be questioned. The Colosseum thus became one of Rome's most effective teaching tools. It did not rely on laws or speeches. It relied on repetition. Seeing the same pattern again and again carved expectation into the mind. When those children later faced authority in courts, markets, or military life, the lessons felt familiar. Power had already introduced itself. Unfairness also shaped how courage was understood. Courage was admired only when it failed beautifully. A fighter who resisted hopeless odds gained brief respect, but death followed anyway. This taught spectators that bravery did not alter destiny. It only made its arrival more dramatic. Over time, this dulled the value of resistance itself. For fighters, this realization arrived painfully. Many entered the arena believing courage could earn mercy. Some discovered that courage only prolonged suffering. Others learned that submission offered better odds. This inversion of values distorted personal identity. Fighters stopped asking who they were and focused on how they were perceived. The Colosseum rewarded those who understood performance over authenticity. A man who felt fear but hid it was stronger than one who felt courage but showed defiance. The arena did not care what lived inside a person. It cared what appeared on the surface. Unfairness made appearance more important than reality. Officials exploited this relentlessly. Fighters who entertained were protected. Fighters who bored were eliminated. Skill without drama was useless. Suffering without expression was wasted. Every disadvantage was calibrated to extract maximum visibility from collapse. The crowd, conditioned by years of exposure, participated instinctively. They shouted encouragement not based on justice, but on narrative. They sensed when a fight was meant to end and demanded closure. Their reactions guided officials, who adjusted imbalance accordingly. In this way, the public became co-authors of unfairness without realizing it. This shared participation dissolved responsibility further. When death arrived, it felt collective. No one felt individually accountable. The system absorbed blame completely, leaving individuals emotionally untouched. This was one of the Colosseum's greatest strengths. Unfair matches also stabilized class divisions. Citizens watched slaves die. Elites watched prisoners beg. The arena reminded everyone where they stood. It reinforced hierarchy visually, repeatedly, and without resistance. Even when a slave fought well, his position never truly changed. Survival did not equal freedom. The few fighters who achieved long careers did not escape this logic. Their survival was conditional. They lived with the constant awareness that protection could vanish without warning. This awareness shaped behavior. Gratitude replaced ambition. Compliance replaced pride. As time passed, the unfairness grew quieter. There was less need for spectacle because acceptance was complete. The audience did not need to be shocked. They needed to be reassured. The Colosseum reassured them that the world still functioned as expected. Power above, vulnerability below. This reassurance mattered deeply in an empire that faced uncertainty at its borders and instability within. The arena offered continuity. No matter what changed outside, inside the Colosseum, the rules remained clear. Someone would lose. Someone would suffer. Authority would decide. The structure also protected leadership. By directing emotional release downward, the arena prevented frustration from rising upward. People exhausted anger on victims rather than questioning systems. This emotional redirection was subtle, but extremely effective. By the time another generation took its place in the stands, the unfair match no longer felt cruel. It felt correct. Correctness replaced curiosity. Once curiosity died, reform became impossible. The Colosseum did not need to argue for itself. It existed as proof of its own necessity. Each unequal fight justified the next. Each acceptance deepened the system's roots. As the sun moved across the stone walls and shadows stretched over the sand, the arena continued, unchanged in purpose, unchanged in structure. Fighters entered. Disadvantages were assigned. Outcomes unfolded along invisible lines already drawn. And Rome watched, calm and assured, believing that what it saw was not injustice but order. Order maintained through imbalance, preserved through repetition, and made permanent by the simple act of looking away. As the Colosseum continued its work across centuries, the unfairness inside it reached a point where it no longer needed explanation, reinforcement, or justification. It existed as background reality, as steady and unquestioned as stone walls or rising dust. This was not accidental. The arena had succeeded in reshaping how people understood conflict itself. Conflict was no longer something to resolve. It was something to witness. By this stage, the Colosseum no longer functioned primarily as a place of entertainment. It functioned as a ritual space, where inequality was reenacted in predictable patterns. Rituals do not surprise. They repeat. The unfair match was one such ritual, performed again and again until it felt inevitable. Spectators arrived already knowing the emotional journey they would experience. Anticipation, tension, release, satisfaction. These emotions did not depend on fairness. In fact, fairness disrupted the ritual. An even contest delayed resolution. It confused expectations. Unfairness simplified the story. Someone would be exposed. Someone would fall. Order would be restored. This predictability comforted the crowd. In a world filled with uncertainty, plagues, wars, shortages, political intrigue, the Colosseum offered stability. No matter what else changed, the arena delivered the same lesson. Power prevailed. Weakness was punished. The system worked. Fighters absorbed this lesson at a deeper level. Many stopped seeing themselves as participants in combat and began seeing themselves as components in a process. Their role was not to win, but to fulfill a function assigned by others. This shift in self-perception marked the final victory of unfairness. When people stop expecting justice, injustice no longer feels violent. It feels normal. The arena reinforced this through controlled hope. Just enough fighters survived long enough to keep belief alive. Just enough mercy was shown to suggest fairness existed somewhere. But this hope was never allowed to grow large enough to threaten the structure. It remained contained like a small flame inside a sealed space. Unfairness also shaped how memory worked. Fighters who died in hopeless matches left little trace. Their names disappeared quickly. Those who survived longer became symbols, not individuals. Their stories were simplified, stripped of context. History remembered outcomes, not systems. This selective memory protected the Colosseum's reputation long after the events themselves faded. Officials relied on this forgetting. The less people remembered specific injustices, the easier it became to repeat them. Time smoothed cruelty into tradition. Tradition became untouchable. The unfair match also trained spectators to separate emotion from responsibility. They felt excitement, fear, and satisfaction, but they did not feel guilt. The arena handled guilt for them by diffusing it across thousands of people. When everyone watched, no one felt personally accountable. This emotional distance was crucial. Without it, the system would collapse under discomfort. With it, the system endured. The physical environment of the Colosseum supported this distance perfectly. The height of the stands, the width of the arena, the way sound echoed and dispersed. These architectural choices created separation. Suffering remained visible, but never intimate. Close enough to thrill, far enough to detach. As years passed, this detachment extended beyond the arena. People carried it into daily life. Inequality elsewhere felt familiar. Harsh punishment felt justified. Mercy felt optional. The Colosseum taught people how to look at suffering without responding to it. For fighters nearing the end of their careers, the unfairness took on a quiet heaviness. Survival did not bring relief. It brought awareness. Awareness that protection could vanish at any moment. Awareness that longevity did not mean safety. Awareness that the system would eventually reclaim what it had delayed. This awareness shaped final performances. Some fighters fought harder, desperate to be remembered. Others fought emptier, conserving energy for an end they accepted. The arena accommodated both. It absorbed effort and resignation equally. The unfair match thus completed its purpose. It did not merely kill bodies. It reshaped expectations. It taught acceptance of imbalance as a fact of life. It removed the idea that fairness was necessary for order. As another season of games progressed, nothing needed to change. The same mechanisms operated. The same patterns repeated. Fighters entered knowing the rules were flexible. Spectators watched knowing outcomes were managed. Officials directed knowing authority would not be questioned. The Colosseum stood unchanged, its presence no longer requiring explanation. It was not simply a place where unfair things happened. It was a place that proved unfairness could be stable, organized, and endlessly repeatable. And as the crowd left once more, carrying satisfaction rather than reflection, the arena remained behind them, patient and silent, ready to perform the same ritual again, one more unequal match at a time. By the final phase of the Colosseum's long life, unfairness was no longer something Rome practiced consciously. It was something Rome was. The arena did not invent inequality, but it perfected how inequality could be displayed, normalized, and preserved without resistance. By repeating the same patterns for generations, the Colosseum turned imbalance into expectation, and expectation into acceptance. At this point, no one inside the system truly believed fairness belonged in the arena. Fighters did not expect it. Officials did not plan for it. Spectators did not demand it. Fairness had quietly exited the conversation long ago, replaced by efficiency, predictability, and emotional control. The Colosseum had achieved what few institutions ever manage. It removed the desire for justice by redefining what felt normal. The final unfairness of the Colosseum was not in any single match, but in how it shaped memory. When people later spoke of the arena, they remembered heroes, dramatic deaths, famous victories, and legendary survivors. They did not remember the thousands of disposable men placed into hopeless situations. They did not remember the calculated disadvantages, the manipulated outcomes, or the silent decisions made underground. History kept the spectacle and erased the structure. This forgetting was not accidental. It was the system's greatest success. The Colosseum trained people to admire outcomes without examining conditions. A victorious gladiator was praised without asking why he survived. A dead fighter was dismissed without asking why he was placed there. This habit extended far beyond the arena. Roman society itself operated the same way. Success was celebrated. Failure was blamed. Systems were never questioned. By the end, the arena no longer needed cruelty to shock. It needed only consistency. The crowd returned because the Colosseum delivered what it always had: reassurance that the world still followed familiar rules. Some lived. Many did not. Power decided. Order remained. When the games finally declined centuries later, it was not because people rejected unfairness. It was because the empire itself changed. Resources shifted. Priorities moved. But the logic of the arena did not disappear. It migrated into courts, into armies, into politics. The lesson endured long after the sand stopped absorbing blood. The Colosseum's legacy is not simply violence. It is normalization. It showed how easily people accept inequality when it is repeated, ritualized, and framed as tradition. It showed how spectacle can replace scrutiny, how participation can erase responsibility, how silence can feel like stability. Standing today as a ruin, the Colosseum appears calm, empty, almost peaceful. But its most powerful function was never noise or blood. It was teaching. Teaching millions of people, slowly and patiently, that unfairness could be organized, justified, and even enjoyed.